So the question that was asked that I want to answer first of all tonight, and then we'll entertain any other questions you might have, was probably asked 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I didn't get to it. And it was, is it wrong to use some of your tithe money to help a family in need? Basically, that's kind of the rough question. If you see a family in need and you buy them groceries or you help them out, is it wrong if you use some of your tithe money to do that? Absolutely, it's a sin. You will probably go to hell if your tithe does not 100% go to the church designated in the pastor's name. If not, then probably your salvation is called into question.
Yeah.
No, in all seriousness, that's a good question, because the question of the tithe and giving comes up a lot. And I will confess to you, I have preached on tithing. I would almost be willing to say, I know I can count on 2 hands the number of times I preached on tithing in the 18 years I've been here as pastor. It's always, and I don't know why it's an uncomfortable subject for me, because it is a thoroughly biblical subject. Jesus talks about giving more than, arguably, I think the only thing that Jesus talks about more than giving is hell, if I remember correctly. Now, this is going to go online and somebody's going to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right in that. And so honestly, it's been probably the reason I haven't preached on it has been more of a fear thing of people thinking that the pastor's asking for money. If I'm just going to be totally blunt and honest with you, we stopped taking up an offering during the service. I think COVID was a good excuse to stop receiving a Sunday morning offering. We had toyed with the idea for a long time before that. We put it at the end of the service for a long time because we never could quite figure out a time to put it in that it felt worshipful. And so anyway, we probably don't talk about giving enough. I won't say probably, we don't talk about giving enough here. And I'm really bad at on Sunday morning not even mentioning that there are offering boxes in the foyer, but the part of me says if people are growing in their faith and they're understanding the principle of tithing, they'll give. And our church has been blessed, and people give, and anyway, a few times over the years we've issued giving challenges. Twice we've done giving campaigns in which we challenged people to give biblically, and we said if you give biblically for 3 months and you do not see God blessing your life, if you ask, we'll give you your money back. And we meant it. And we've never had anybody come and ask us for their money back. I had one couple who almost did. I think I've shared that story before. They got real close, and then God just started doing miracle after miracle in their life. Now, I'm not talking about guaranteed blessing, don't get me wrong. But what I am saying is that we can't outgive God, and when we are faithful to God, God's faithful to us. So, is it wrong if I see somebody hurting and I use some of my tithe money to help them? Well, let's talk about just the tithe first of all. What is a tithe? Help me out. You can talk to me.
So it's not tenth.
Yeah, a tenth. It means a tenth. So in the Old Testament is where the concept of the tithe is introduced and is part of the law of Moses. And what's God's purpose in the Old Testament for the tithe?
Priest.
Yeah, there are 2 purposes really. The priest, one is God is instituting the priesthood. The priests don't have land property like everybody else does. They're doing the work of God in the tabernacle or wherever they may be. And so God institutes the tithe as a way to support the priesthood. So that's the number one reason. What's the number two? Maybe I won't even say that's number one reason. It's one of two reasons. What's the second reason?
Way of giving thanks to God.
Yeah. Everything belongs to God. God owns 100% of everything that we have. He gives it to us to steward. And he says, as a test of faith, test of trust, I want you to give back to me a tenth of what I've given you to steward. And so the Old Testament concept is a tithe, a tenth, and the concept in the Old Testament is a tithe of the first fruits. So if you want to put it in 2025 language, that would mean a tithe of the gross of your income. Okay? So that's the principle. The principle is the tithe. And if you're equating that in a New Testament context, then the tithe primarily is designed to go to the church that you attend, that you consider your home, for the work of the ministry. And that is for everything the church does, whether it's the building that you worship in, the outreach ministries that the church supports, the staff that the church pays, whatever the case may be. It's interesting to me that the tithe is the best form of equality that there is, because everybody gives the same percentage regardless of what their income is. And that means if your income is small, then your tithe is small. If your income is larger, then your tithe is larger, but you're giving proportionally to what you have. I've often wondered, what if our government would get smart enough to think that way? Would that be helpful? I know, was it quite a few years ago when Mike Huckabee was running for president, that was one of, and I'm not advocating either way, but that was one of his platforms was a flat tax that was just a straight percentage across the board that everybody gave a percentage. I don't know, he was a pastor. I don't know if he was basing that on the principle of the tithe in the Old Testament, or if it was just something he thought was smart fiscally. But anyway, so the principle is a tithe, and the principle is where you worship. Now, that's the principle. In the New Testament, we know that we are set free from the law, and now the law is written on our hearts. Does that mean that the tithe goes away? Well, what it means is we live according to the principle of the law, the heart of the law. And so Paul puts it this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. Remember this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work, as it is written. They have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, their righteousness endures forever. So the principle of the law is a tithe to where you worship. But the heart of the law is God says, decide in your heart what you're going to give, and give it cheerfully. What is God going to bless more? somebody who gives 7% but gives it with all their heart and out of love and adoration and faithfulness to God, or somebody who gives 10% and is giving it with a clenched fist because they feel an obligation to the law. Which one does God going to bless more?
A cheerful.
Yeah, the cheerful giver. Samuel said this, it is better to obey than to sacrifice. And so the heart is what matters more. And so my point in that would be, is that all giving ultimately is a matter of the heart. So if you're riding down the road and you feel compelled to help this person, but you don't have a lot of extra, you have your tithe, but beyond your tithe, you know that you don't have a lot to give. Is God going to say, I can't believe that you didn't give that to me and that you fed that person? Well, what does Jesus say? Whatever you do to the least of these, you do also to me. And so I would say that to obey God and what God is putting on your heart is the most important thing. And so if God tells you to buy that person a breakfast at Chick-fil-A, and that means that you're going to give $9.34. Not that I know how much the egg white grill meal at Chick-fil-A is. If your tithe is going to be $9.34 less, I don't think God is going to hold that over your head. Because again, it's a matter of the heart. And so decide in your heart what you're going to give, and give joyfully. I think the challenge is often, they say many times, I don't know, I don't look at our, I know what comes in. Like I see, we have church management software, and I see in church management software what the total offering was on Sunday. But I do not look at individual giving. There are a couple reasons I don't look at individual giving. Number one, I don't want to know what you give. I don't think it's my place to know. The Bible says, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And so it's not my... Some pastors would say, well, it is my right, because if they're going to serve, I need to know that they're giving. And I'm like, you know what? That's between them and Jesus. And if I feel led to ask them to serve in some way and they say yes, then what they do is between them and the Lord. And so I don't look at it for that reason. No, I don't want to know. And number two, I would like to think that I would not be, but I do not want to think that I would ever be swayed to treat someone differently based on how much or how little they give. And so as a pastor, I just don't want to know those things. There are probably only 2 people in this church who actually would even know. 3 counting this year, probably, with one person that we added to that, to the financial, as the financial secretary. And I don't even know that they would know offhand, because every week you're counting and recording real quick and throwing it in there. So, but anyway, so I say all the time when we do the Discover Riverside class here, we don't have a EMC police that come and check up on you and make sure that you're doing everything that you should be doing. We leave things like that up to your heart. Now, should we challenge people more to give? Probably. I think the general rule in the church, in churches across the board, is giving probably usually only reflects about 20 to 30% of the congregation who give faithfully in any congregation. The number's around 20 to 30%. Maybe we should challenge people more often because of what God tends to do when we are faithful to Him. He is faithful to us. And when we, this principle of sowing and reaping is absolutely biblical. I'm not saying, sow your $1,000 seed and you're going to become a millionaire. But what I am saying is Scripture says that when we sow generously, we reap generously. And that may not always mean financially. Sometimes it's spiritually, it's spiritual blessing. But sometimes it is financial blessing. I remember there was a man in the Greensboro church. His name was Willie Stone. And Willie was one of the most faithful people in the church. Not a wealthy man. He worked at Tallheimer's Hex department store. Back in the day, he was a maintenance guy there, worked there probably 50 years until he retired. That's what he did. And so he didn't make a whole lot of money, but I would bet you he ate out at a fast food restaurant maybe 5 times in his whole life. He grew everything he ate, saved every dime that he possibly could, but he also gave a lot. In fact, I can tell this now because he passed away and he can't whip me, but I announced there was a house that came up for sale right beside I lived in the church parsonage, and it was like we had, property-wise, it was a road here, our church, fellowship hall, a road right here, then a house that was owned by somebody, and then my house, and our parking lot in between. And the house on that corner came up for sale. And I mentioned on Wednesday night, if there was some way we could buy that house, we would own this whole rectangle of property here, and we could use that house for whatever. And so Willie called me that next morning, and he said, "How much do you think we could get that house for?" And we didn't have any money. I mean, there was a small church. And I said, "I don't know." I said, it's probably falling apart. They were asking 60 for it. I said, if we offered him 40 and we gave him a tax write-off for the other 20,000, they might take it. And he said, "Call them." I said, "Willie, we can't afford it." He said, "Just call them, just see what they say." And so I called him and I asked the guy, and he said, "Yeah." He said, if you could afford 40,000, we'd take it. And so I called Willie and I said, I don't really, we'd have to do some kind of big fundraiser. And he showed up at my door with a $40,000 check and said, "Buy the house." This is not a wealthy man. But anyway, he told a story a long time ago about how when he was a young man first saved and learning to give, he was at a missions conference. And they were talking about sacrificing for missions, giving tithes and offerings is what the Old Testament calls it. Tithe and then giving above your tithe. And so they were talking about giving above your tithe to really support these missions and giving sacrificially, trusting God to meet the need. And he said he had $50 in his wallet, which was going to be their groceries for the month, because this would have been 1940, 41 back. So, like I said, it was a good while back. Mm-hmm. And he said he felt led of the Lord to put that whole $50 in the offering plate. Mm-hmm. And so he did. And he got home that night. And he told his wife, her name was Ruby, he said, "Ruby, I don't know what we're going to do for groceries, but I felt like the Lord told me to put that $50 in the offering plate for the missionary tonight," which I don't know what that $50 would be today, probably $450, somewhere around there. And he said he thought Ruby would flip out. Those weren't the words he would have used, but she said, "Willie, if that's what you think the Lord wants us to do, then we'll what does she say? We'll eat ketchup sandwiches all week, all month if we need to." And he said the next day, the very next day, he went out to get the mail, and he had won a $50 gift certificate to the local grocery store in a raffle. And he said, I never even entered a raffle to win a $50 gift certificate. But I went to the grocery store with that $50 certificate and bought our groceries for the month. So God bless them with their groceries anyway. All right. Questions, comments, thoughts? Now I'll put my glasses on so I can see.